This is our Simondon reading group. We're still on Individuation Volume 2. This may be our last session, or depending on how far we get in the text today. So we're still reading Form Information Potentials. So last time, let's see, what did we do last time? So last time we looked at Simondon's criticism of Gestalt theory, Gestalt psychology. Simondon thinks that the notion of form that Gestalt psychology introduces is an important contribution, but he thinks that the equation of this form with a stable state, an equilibrium state, is a mistake. So in Gestalt psychology, there's this sort of idea that the stable form, that the good form is the stable form, in the same way that, so I mentioned this last time, in the same way that a bubble forms in a spherical shape because it minimizes surface tension. Likewise, our perceptual apparatus would sort of realize a stable state because it minimizes some quantity. And so when we perceive a circle over a background of other shapes, for example, that circle would be a stable equilibrium state. And Simondon points out, he's discussed this issue in Volume 1 as well, but he points out again here that the forms that are good forms in the sense that they stand out and we perceive them easily, or they have a quality of attraction to them in the sense that we, turn towards them and perceive them as being well formed and beautiful in general. These forms are not necessarily simple forms, and often are not the simplest forms. And so in Volume 1, when we looked at this question, he mentions the human face, of course, as a key example. So human faces are not simple geometric figures. They're very complex figures, but then you can still recognize a human face despite various, you can have a face masked by different lines or partially covered or whatever, and you can still recognize it as a face, and you can often recognize the person who is hidden. So a human face is a good form in that sense, but it's not a stable form or an equilibrium state. It's not a simple minimization of some quantity. And Simondon also in Volume 1 mentioned the role of animal forms in perception of children. So children can perceive an animal for the first time, and they can recognize, this end is the head and this is the tail, and these are the legs and so on. They recognize the sort of body schema of the animal. And so this animal shape has a good form for this child. But again, a shape of an animal is not a simple geometrical figure that can be derived by minimizing some quantity. And so Simondon takes this to be a general sort of issue for Gestalt psychology, or the theory behind Gestalt psychology. And then likewise, he makes another similar type of criticism in relation to cybernetics, or to information theory in particular. So the mathematical theory of communication introduces the quantitative measure of the information contained in a message, which has to do with the probability of the states of the source given the message. So if you have a simple source, like you're flipping a coin and transmitting the result of that coin flip to someone, across the city or whatever, then the source has only two states, and so the signal only carries one bit of information. It either tells you that's heads or tails. And then a more complex source, so a source that can emit multiple different types of messages, would the signal would carry more information. But then Simondon points out that in this situation, the more the source and the receiver sort of line up with each other, the more they are in sync with each other, the less information is transmitted. And in certain applications or in certain domains, this is a sort of paradoxical consequence. And he talks about learning, for example. Um, so when you learn, um, so like I guess an example would be a baseball player learns to detect what kind of pitch is coming in, based on different properties of the flight of the ball. They can sort of predict where the ball will end up and then how to hit it with the bat. Uh, and when you're a starting baseball player or someone who doesn't really know anything about baseball, of course, you don't really receive any information about the flight of the ball. You just see a ball coming towards you and you sort of swing at it wildly. Um, and it's only as you learn to detect the different pitches that you actually start to receive information and about where the ball is going to end up. And so in this case, it seems like learning is actually a process of being able to receive more information, whereas on the sort of mathematical quantitative theory of information, learning should be something like the more you acquire information about the source, the less information the signal contains for you, or the less uncertainty there is for you about the source. And so Simondon points out that this is a sort of paradoxical consequence. So both Gestalt psychology and information theory have these sort of paradoxical consequences in terms of how they make sense of form and information. And so he wants to sort of introduce new concepts that allow for a better conceptualization of the of form and information that will avoid these kinds of consequences. And so that's where we left off last time when he introduced his notion of tension of information, which is how he's going to try to solve this problem. So I'll pick up from there and read a page, and then we'll discuss. Perhaps it would be possible, and this is the starting point for our personal thesis that we would like to present now, to speak of a quality of information or of a tension of information. In an energy like electrical energy, one considers a factor of quantity, intensity multiplied by time, and a qualitative factor related to the difference of potential between the boundaries and the source. In the same way, it would perhaps be possible to characterize form in order to explain processes of interaction, not only by its quantity, but by its tension, and the good form would be one that corresponds to an elevated tension. Tension obviously seems like a rather singular term. However, if it is permitted to continue using this analogy between the natural sciences and what would like to be the initiator, the structural germ of a human science, would it not be possible to invoke this type of notion? The quantity of energy that can be stored in a condenser is increasingly elevated for a certain surface of armatures the closer they are brought together, all while remaining isolated, unless we wind up with a disruptive discharge through the insulator. Is there not something analogous in good form? Would it not be that which contains in it a certain field, i.e., both an isolation between two antithetical contradictory terms, and nevertheless a correlation? Wouldn't the good form be one that contains an elevated field of form, i.e., a good distinction, a good isolation between the two terms or the plurality of terms that constitute it, and yet between them an intense field, i.e., a power of producing energetic effects if something is introduced into it? The fact that there is a significant electrostatic field between two condenser armatures is indicated by the fact that if a body is introduced into this field, it becomes intensely charged. Wouldn't there be something similar in the good form? The good form, as Plato predicted, would be a dyad or a plurality of coordinated dyads together, i.e., already a network, a schema, something simultaneously one and multiple, that contains a correlation between different terms, a rich correlation between different and distinct terms. One and multiple, the significative link of the one and the multiple. This would be the structure of form. If this were true, it could be said that the good form is one that is close to paradox, close to contradiction, all while not being contradictory in logical terms. And the tension of form would be defined in the following way. The fact of approaching paradox without becoming a paradox, approaching contradiction without becoming a contradiction. This can only be a hypothesis, one that supposes an analogy between the natural sciences and the human sciences. In this sense, one would speak of a tension of form and to the same extent a quality of information, which would be a concentration up until the point where it attains a point of disruption, a joining of contraries into a unity, the existence of a field internal to this schema of information, a certain dimension uniting aspects or dynamisms that are usually incompatible. This good form or form rich in potential would be a tensed complex, concentrated systematized plurality. In language, it would become a semantic organism. I'll stop here because this is another long paragraph. Um, right. So here he's brought in this notion of attention of information, and I can maybe mention here as well that the word tension here in French, tension is the word for voltage in French as well. So Simondon is working with a sort of electrical analogy here. The idea is in the same way that you have an electrical charge that can be discharged in certain conditions. Likewise, we have this tension of information, this sort of state of a potential that can be discharged in certain conditions and produce effects. And he points out that this notion of attention of information requires something like this indefinite dyad that Plato had introduced and that Simondon talked about earlier. So to have attention of information, the same way as to have an electrical charge, you have to have two elements. You have to have a dyad, and there's a difference in potential between the two. And so this notion of a dyad is sort of incorporated into the notion of tension that Simondon is introducing. And so that's sort of the reason why he went over this notion of the dyad in Plato earlier in the text. And then this notion of a dyad is not just sort of two things next to each other. It's this combination of the one and the multiple. So it's these two things that are separate, but at the same time have this relation to each other. And I think we can probably tie this together with Simondon's account of relation as having the status of being. So it's only when there is this relation in the true sense of the term, this relation that has the status of being between two terms, only in that case that there's a real tension of information between those two terms. So when we have just two entities that exist next to each other but don't have this real relation between them, there would be no tension of information in that situation.
This section is interesting in light of what he was just talking about at the end of our last session, which is the idea that in information theory, the closer the transmitter is to the receiver, the less information there is. But it seems like he wants to argue that for the qualitative factor that he's talking about, the closer the terms are, the greater the tension is, and therefore the higher the quality of information. I don't know if that, I guess intuitively it seems like it should be the opposite way, that the greater the distance, the greater the contradiction between the two terms, so long as it isn't so great that a signification can't be worked out of it, the greater the tension would be. But maybe it's just the way that he is, it's the fact that he used this paradigm from technical paradigm about the armatures, which I don't really understand, that is the reason that he was talking about bringing the elements together, and maybe it wasn't in response to the earlier point about information theory.
Yeah, I think this bit is a little bit difficult because of the sort of analogical nature of his argument here. So he's taking, as you said, this technical paradigm from electronics, and then he's sort of applying it to, or he's trying to extract a schema from it that can be used in the foundation of the human sciences. And so that leaves us with sort of a problem of understanding, what exactly does it mean to say that two, I guess, concepts or two elements of a concept are distant or close to each other. That like you can maybe make sense of this in terms of similarity, but we've seen in other texts that Simondon thinks that similarity is a kind of misleading notion in relation to analogy. But yeah, I think the distance. So the part that we read last time, where he talks about the I guess, correspondence between the emitter and the receiver, and the reduction of the quantity of information transmitted with the degree of correspondence between the two. I think maybe we should not think of that as a kind of distance. I think I think what he wants us to think about here in this notion of tension of information is not sort of yeah, it's not a distance in the sense that it has to do with an intensity as opposed to an extensive quantity. So when you measure and so this like the difference between extensive and intensive quantities, for anyone who is not familiar with this notion, has to do with the way that they can be manipulated. An extensive quantity like volume, for example, you can take a volume and you can divide it in half, and then you have two half volumes. But in an intensive quantity like temperature, you can't say like divide 30 degrees in half and produce 15 degrees or something like that. It doesn't really make sense to divide it. It's just a scale. And I think his notion here of attention of information is meant to be an intensive quantity, whereas the information theoretic concept of the information contained in a signal is one that's an extensive quantity. If you receive half of a message, you've received half as much information as you would have received if you received the whole message. And so this tension of information, because it's this intensive quantity, I think we can't really think of it as a distance. But yeah, there is, I think in the way he sets it out here, we are meant to think of it as sort of the converse of the case of the correspondence between the emitter and the receiver that he talked about earlier. So whereas in this quantitative theory of information, the correspondence between the emitter and receiver reduces the amount of information that can be transmitted between them. In the case of this intensive tension theory of information, there's the more the emitter and the receiver are in correspondence with each other, the more the more they can be in tension, the more potentially the more information that dyad between the two can have.
So maybe the correspondence between the terms in the qualitative sense would be something like internal resonance in the system.
Yeah, I think that's a good suggestion because, like he talked about, like just what the part we read last week, he talked about the resonance of oscillators. So the oscillators will resonate with each other if they're set to the same frequency, or if they are at a similar frequency. And I guess, I guess this resonating is sort of the tension of information in that situation. So the oscillators that are not at the same frequency will not enter into resonance with each other. So they won't produce this sort of new structure in the situation. And whereas the oscillators that are at a similar frequency will enter into resonance with each other, and so the situation will undergo this new structuration. So I think that notion of internal resonance is a good suggestion here. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit. So we stopped right at the top of 689, where there would be compatibility. If someone else would like to read.
Yeah, I can read. There would be compatibility in the internal reverberation of a schema within it. And perhaps it would also be possible to measure the potential of form, the tension of form, in the same way that an electrical tension is measured, i.e. by the quantity of obstacles that it manages to overcome, the external resistance across which it manages to produce an effect. It can be said that a generator possesses in its terminals a tension that is more elevated than that of another generator if it can manage to transmit the same current across a greater chain of resistances. across resistances whose total is more elevated. This property is what would characterize the form's pregnancy. The pregnancy of the form would not be its stability in the sense of the thermodynamics of stable states and convergent series of transformations, but its capacity to traverse, animate, and structure a varied domain, increasingly varied and heterogeneous domains. The difference between this hypothesis and that of information theory is the fact that a theory of the tension of information supposes that the possible series of receivers are open. The tension of information is proportional to a schema's capacity to be received as information by receivers that are not defined in advance. Thus, while a probabilistic theory can be applied to the measurement of the quantity of information in the prediction of an exchange between emitter and receiver, a measurement of the tension of information could hardly occur except through experimentation, at least under current conditions. For example, it can be said that the hylomorphic schema or the notion of archetype possesses a high tension of information because each one has incited structures of significations for 24 centuries across widely diverse cultures. The tension of information would be a schema's property to structure a domain, to propagate through it, to organize it. But the tension of information cannot act alone. It does not also contribute all the energy that can guarantee the transformation. It only contributes this tension of information, i.e., a certain arrangement that can modulate much more considerable energies deposited in the domain that will receive the form, take on a structure. There can be form taking only if two conditions are joined together: the tension of information contributed by a structural germ and an energy harbored by the milieu that takes form. The milieu, which corresponds to the old notion of matter, must be in a tensed metastable state, like a supersaturated or supercooled solution, which is waiting for the crystalline germ so that it can pass to the stable state by unleashing the energy that it harbors. So there is both a tension in the seed of information and a tension in the system that will be informed, but the tension of information is structural in the seed and energetic in the milieu. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I'm not sure. There's definitely a potential in the milieu that undergoes structuration. I'm not sure whether we should call that a tension of information, though.
The tension of information is in the seed, but he says the matter or the milieu is also in a tensed metastable state.
Yeah, so I think we want to distinguish between the tensed metastable state and the tension of information. Maybe not a great choice of terminology here to use this term tense or tension in both cases, but I think we should be thinking of the tension of information as the property of the crystalline germ, and then the metastable state as a state of potential to be structured, to receive structure. I think that's how we are meant to understand this relationship between the two. And so the tension of information would be contained in the crystalline germ, or whatever sort of structural condition plays the role of the crystalline germ in a different domain. And so this is the term in the relation that bears the tension of information.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you know when was this before? Was this talk before the dissertation was written?
I think it was definitely in the same time period as he was writing the dissertation. I'm not sure whether he had already submitted the dissertation when this talk was given or not, but it's definitely contemporary with the writing of the dissertation.
I guess I had been thinking of it seems like there's more of an emphasis on this. Well, I haven't read the physical individuation section for a long time, but my understanding of that, at least looking back through the other stuff that we've read, is that the seed, I don't know, it seems like the seed should be part of the energetic system. I would think that the system would be. So I think it isn't the seed sort of one of the terms in the dispiration that results in the information of the crystal, and as one of the terms, it would seems like it is itself part of the energetic system.
Yeah, so it definitely has to be an energetic interaction between the solution and the seed crystal, and that interaction is what brings about the structuration of the solution to form the crystal. I think, yeah. So in volume one, in the section on physical individuation, we noticed as we were going through it that he kind of hesitates between describing the situation as one in which there are two interacting terms: the structural term, or a structural condition, and the energetic condition. And then also sometimes he describes it in terms of three terms. So he introduces the energetic condition as a third factor in this interaction. And yeah, so there's a certain amount of ambiguity in terms of how many factors this relationship is meant to have, or how many elements we're supposed to think of in this conceptual schema. But I think the uh, uh, here we can think of what is shared between the yeah, we can think of the energetic condition as what is shared between the structural term and the material, or yeah, so in this case the crystalline germ and the solution. So energy is what they share, but they have different organizations of that energy. And so this is why he talks about the crystalline germ as modulating the energy of the solution. So the solution has a certain amount of thermal energy that is in a sort of disorganized state, and then the crystalline germ modulates that energy and imposes a structure on it, or brings about a structuration of that energy. So Simondon is comparing this to a modulator in electronics, where you have a carrier signal with a high amount of energy, or a relatively high amount of energy, and then a modulator signal with a relatively low amount of energy that modulates the carrier signal. So I think, yeah, I think we can think of energy as what is common, or as the shared property of, or as the sort of domain of interaction between the seed crystal and the material condition. But the information is the property that the seed crystal has of being able to bring about a structuration of the material.
Okay, thank you. That makes sense.
And yeah, so we see here he gives us some examples of what exactly this would mean. So when he talks about how the hylomorphic schema, for example, we can see this as having a high tension of information, um, in the sense that this schema of thought was sort of the dominant mode of understanding the universe for, well, he says 24 centuries. That's maybe a bit of an exaggeration, but for the Western world, for hundreds of years, the this notion of form and matter was sort of the central notion around which all of the science and philosophy of the time was organized. And this was the case in a variety of different cultural contexts. So in the early medieval Islamic worlds, Aristotelian philosophy was sort of the dominant school, and then it was transferred into Western Europe. And so you have very different cultures that adopt this schema, or the schema is capable of structuring thought in these very different cultural domains. And so it's in this way, this example gives us a way of understanding what it means for a schema of thought to have a high degree or high tension of information. So any thought schema that is capable of bringing about this kind of structuration in a wide variety of domains of thought in different cultures, different time periods, etc. This is something that has a high tension of information, and then an idea that someone maybe proposes and then only has application in one limited domain of thought and only in one particular cultural context is one that would have less or a lower degree of information, of tension of information. And so this gives us, I mean, he says we can't really measure the tension of information, but this gives us a sort of approximation of, estimating the degree of tension of information of different ideas. We can sort of compare the extent to which they are capable of bringing about this structuration in a wide variety of different domains. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit. If someone else would like to read from this particular type of rapport.
Let me do it.
Sure.
This particular type of rapport diverges between the structural germ tension of information and informable metastable domain, which harbors a potential energy, turns the operation of form taking into a modulation. The form is comparable to the signal that conveys a relay without adding energy to the work of the actuator. Nevertheless, structures that can be compared to technical modulator are much rarer than domains in which processes of form taking arise. In order for the hypothesis we have advanced to be applicable in all cases, it is therefore advisable to indicate according to what processes of form taking can take place by way of modulation within a domain that is not contained in a modulator. We suppose that the operation of modulation then take place in a microstructure that advances progressively through the domain that takes form, constituting the moving limit between the informed and thus stable part, and the not yet informed and thus still metastable part of domain. In the majority of cases of form taking, this operation would transductive, i.e., advancing little by little, starting with a region that has already received the form and going toward that which remains metastable, will therefore again find a mobile asymmetry of holomorphic couple with a meta capable of tendency and the archetypal power of the form that privileges the form taking. If this hypothesis deserves to be kept, it must be applied to the different types of form taking, from ontogenesis and phylogenesis up to group phenomena, and it must allow us to indicate processes of interaction that conform to the schema of modulation, generally according to a transductive mode. In the domain of somatic ontogenesis, studies like those of Arnold Gesell on growth and embryology of behavior seems to be able to axiomatized by notions like those we have just proposed as a hypothesis. Indeed, for Gesell, the ontogenesis of behavior from conception till death is an evolution that marks the succession of a certain number of stages, sometimes of adaptation to external worlds, sometimes of the least apparent differentiation of adaptive adjustments that the search for new adjustment. The crisis through which these new adaptive adjustments are thought is characterized by what Gesell calls self-regulative fluctuations. The studies he has conducted on the regime of the self-sustenance of infants reveal that an infant by itself is capable of finding the structures of adaptation for feeding behavior, and for the regime of rest and waking, just as much as when it is left to act by itself, as if definite frameworks were imposed on it. If it is left to act by itself for a certain time, it goes on a diet, for example, of 7 meals a day, and then sleeps for a certain time. Afterwards, when maturation has generated new tendencies and new demands, a period of differentiation and disadaptation intervenes. The infant wakes at any moment whatsoever, seeks nourishment. When it cries, all of a sudden it restructures its activity. but on the basis of 6 meals a day. After a certain amount of time, there is another phase of differentiation, then an order of 5 meals, and so on. The schema is clear. Alternation of adaptations to the external world and of these adaptations. These adaptations mark a moment in the search for a new structure when the already constituted regimen of adaptation no longer corresponds to internal tendencies and to the level of the organism's maturation of the nervous system, of the digestive system, of the motor system. In certain American authors, Gagel and Carmichael, we find a generalization of this idea in the notion of ontogenesis of behavior, which consists in a succession of paths of adaptation followed by disadaptation and differentiation. The patterns, i.e., the schemas of an initial adaptation, seem lost the moment when one arrives at the differentiation, but in fact, they are found to be reincorporated into the new adaptation. Thus, in the study of what he calls progression in the human infant, i.e., the fact of advancing in the prone position concerning human nourishment before the age of 1 year, Gessler discovers 4 successive cycles: crawling, then crawling on all fours, then crawling on all extended fours, and finally walking upright. However, the patterns that are acquired in crawling arrive at a type of perfection at the end of this initial period, then abruptly, when maturation is sufficient, this adaptation occurs. The infant begins crawling poorly. It crawls poorly and stands up on its arms, places itself on its knees. It no longer advances. It is disadapted. It then seeks a new type of adaptation, and within this new type of adaptation, ipsilateral and contralateral relations of inhibition and facilitation, which already existed in crawling, are utilized again. The crawling is lost, yet the content of crawling is not totally lost, but reincorporated. Consequently, there is a type of dialectics in this learning. This learning and maturation go together, such that in walking upright, whereas an ipsilateral or contralateral link in crawling becomes alternating movements of the arms and legs that allow for a harmonious equilibrium. It is possible to interrupt the ontogenesis of behavior as created by the succession of highly formalized individualized moments of full adaptation to the external world, and of moments characterized, on the contrary, by the presence of tension, which appears to the purely behaviorist observer as a disadaptation and consequently as a regression, by which in reality show that the organism is in the process of constituting within it what could be called the systems of potentials, starting from which this domain of somewhat liquidated elementary schemas, thereby constituting a metastable field like a supercooled solution, will be able to be structured very quickly by its own energy around the theme of organization, presenting a higher tension of form. That would be enough, right?
Yes, that's good. We can stop here. Thanks. Right. So yeah, so this is another sort of example of actually, before I get to the example, I'll just mention that he introduces again his notion of transduction here. So transduction would be form-taking operations that progress from one formed part of a domain that sort of progressively structures the domain on the basis or starting from this one partially structured point. So again, this is the crystallization example where you have the seed or the germ crystal that's inserted into the solution, and then the solution crystallizes progressively around the crystal that grows until it uses up all of the solution. So this is the notion of transduction that we've seen throughout volume 1. But then he wants to pass to an application of this concept of or this schema of tension of information to human science, and specifically to psychology of infant behavior. And I think this application is not 100% clear. I think he he gives a description of the results that these psychologists have discovered, but mapping those results onto the schema is not 100% obvious. But the idea here, so we have this fact that infants undergo these stages of development where they have a well-adapted behavior in a certain mode, whether it's, for example, in the feeding behavior, they have a schedule where they are eating 7 times a day, for example, and sleeping in between. And then after a while, they that schedule breaks down, and then they sort of sleep and wake up and want to eat at sort of random times, and then after a while again, that schedule sort of gets structured on the basis of 6 meals a day instead of 7. And then likewise in locomotion, you have the infant that is capable of crawling and can get around in an adequate way by crawling. And then that crawling behavior sort of starts to break down, and the infant is sort of starting to lift itself up off the ground, and then after a while, it will start to walk. And so in both cases of infant behavior here, we have this sort of cycle of adapted behavior, and then deadaptation or apparent deadaptation, and then a new adaptation afterwards. And he actually uses the term dialectics for this, and that's something again we've seen throughout Volume 1. He sometimes describes his own theory in terms of dialectics, and sometimes rejects that term. But here we should think of the behavior, the whole sort of system of behavior, as this domain that will undergo structure. So the infant is capable of sort of a wide variety of behaviors. You can move its arms and legs in various ways, but it undergoes this process of structuration so that it will only move its arms and legs in a certain pattern, and that pattern brings about locomotion, whether it's in crawling or walking or whichever form of locomotion. So the relationship between the cyclical nature of the development process and the schema of thought, the relationship between the tension of information and the material condition, that relationship is not clear. So the cyclical nature is something that seems to be new in this example and wasn't really introduced in the other examples.
The part what Angus had read that part, my understanding about that part, based on your explanation and the discussion, it must be a continuing process of a hylomorphic transformation that's happening. If that's right, and then my question related to that is speed and the vector. What I want to say here is that the example here, like the study of Arnold Gesell, which is called about the somatic ontogenesis, it's like some parts a little bit slow, or the other parts a little bit speedier, things like that. And that's kind of like what Simon Dong explains, like the difference. I mean, metastable, stable state coexist at the same time. That's a question. But another question related to vector is that only goes to forward. It doesn't go back. That's a question, because we don't have to relate to Deleuze, but if you would think like this is kind of rhetoralization, something like that, rhetoralization, some kind of acts action can be retarded. I mean, it goes back to the older version, something like that. And you can think of it as some kind of modulation, or just going back to the previous form and then matter altogether. So first question is the speed and vector. And then in relation to this question, I'm thinking about the multiplicity of elements, and then kind of action, reaction, interaction could happen between them too. What I want to say is that, for example, if you think of something which has like some kind of like a stable state and metasphere altogether, not really thinking like the milieu, I mean exterior milieu within it, like of course that is composed of some elements, and then among them there could be some kind of like a transaction inside it. You could make everything more complex, but just wondering if that could happen. Yeah, that's yeah. So related to that, like as far as I understand, it's not linear reaction, right? It's kind of more like if you visualize it, it would be more like a spider kind of process, as far as I understand. So how? Well, what do you think of that? Like first one speed and vector, and second one is like within the something there could be some other further reactions or actions, interactions altogether.
Yeah, I think the notion of a spiral is probably a good one here, because as he talks about with this infant development example, the infant is perfectly capable of getting around by crawling, and that's a perfectly adequate mode of locomotion. But then at some point, that crawling motion breaks down, and so this, if you're just looking at behavior in terms of how effective is it at reaching a certain goal, then this is a kind of regression. It's a kind of um, uh, lack or a kind of loss of a capacity that the infant had before that stage is reached. But Simondon wants to see it instead of seeing it as a regression or a loss. He wants us to see it in terms of a destructuring, which is a sort of preliminary to a restructuring. So we can think of this as a kind of spiral of structure, and then an absence of structure, and then a new state of structure, which would be at a sort of higher level of structure. So the spiral is a good image here because, on the one hand, the spiral is linear, so there is like a progression of the whatever object is moving in the spiral motion. The object is moving forward in some sense, but then on the other hand, it's all that forward motion is part of a cyclical motion as well. So yeah, I think the spiral is a good image to think of here. In terms of the sort of speed question, I think, yeah, again, I think Simondon would not want us to be thinking of these processes in terms of measurement. I think he does say in this text that we don't really have a means of measuring the tension of information. So I think like in certain respects, you can take a process like the child learning to walk, and you can measure, and you can say it takes 12 months or whatever before the child learns how to walk. But in another respect, the learning to walk is not really a temporal process. Like the infant either can walk or can't, and there's a sort of how to put this. Yeah, so the sort of structure taking operation is not something that happens over the course of time in this case. So depending on what situation it is, it might be something you can measure in terms of time, or something that you can't measure in terms of time. So yeah, I think thinking of these processes in terms of speed might not be the best way of thinking about it. Like, I guess if you want to compare like the speed of an infant walking, you can compare one infant to another and say this infant learned to walk in 11 months, and this one took 13 months or whatever. But if you want to compare the process of infants learning to walk, compare that to, I don't know, the process of birds learning to fly, for example. It's hard to say that one is faster than the other, even if one takes less time than the other. They're different processes, so they aren't really comparable in terms of speed.
Yeah, yes. Helpful. Thank you so much.
On the previous page, when he talks about transduction again, where did he say it? Oh yeah, where he says that in a modulation, where he says form taking is a modulation. It's comparable to the signal it conveys a relay without adding energy to the work of the actuator. That reminded me of his discussion of Descartes in a couple of places. Both the kind of lossless transfer, I think is how he describes it, of Descartes' the structure of his reasoning, and then also in a few places he talks about the pituitary gland animal spirits thing, but I think he talks about that as it doesn't actually work in Descartes, but if it were to work, it would be through a transfer of like a very small amount of energy or a small amount of work from the thinking part to the extended part. And it seems like this sort of recalls those discussions and maybe a way that, I don't know if he wants to think of transduction in terms of Descartes' the lossless transfer of his reasoning process, or if he wants to think of it in terms of the relay system, I think is what he called it, of the pituitary gland in his his anatomy, I guess.
Yeah, that's. I'm glad you brought that up. That's a good sort of connection to make here, because so in Simondon's discussion of Descartes' physiology, Descartes has this notion of the how it is that the soul can direct the motions of the body, and it's by changing the direction of the animal spirits in the nervous system. And so he thinks that all the nerves sort of converge on the pineal gland, and then the pineal gland is where this change of direction of the animal spirits happens. And so he has to think of it in terms of change of direction, because he has an account of the conservation of the quantity of motion in his physics. It's one of the central principles of his physics. The only thing that the soul can affect in relation to the motion of the body is the direction of the motion and not the quantity of the motion. And so Simondon compares this to a relay. It would be like sort of an infinitely perfect relay in the sense that it would not the modulator would not have any energetic influence on the signal, on the carrier signal. It would be an infinitely small modulator. And of course, this physically is impossible to realize. And Simondon points out this fact. And this is sort of connected with the fact that for Descartes, the soul shouldn't be able to act on the body in any way, because they're completely separate substances. So even the animal spirits are just pieces of extended substance. So there's no sense in which the soul can act on the animal spirits more easily than it can on the rest of the body, for example. So I think this is this notion of a relay modulating the energy contained in the body is possibly what he's also thinking of here in this text. But he wants to think of it not in terms of this sort of infinitely perfect relay, but a real physical relay in which there's this energetic interaction between the modulator and the carrier signal. So in this case, there's a finite amount of energy. The modulator might have a very small amount of energy, but it's still a finite quantity and not infinitely small.
Sorry, I know we've spent a long time on this section, but the long paragraph about the ontogenesis of behavior, it almost made me think that the way that the behavior of the infant moves from a kind of adaptation to a disadaptation in response to a problem, and then a new adaptation, well, a problem and or a capacity, and then this leads to a new adaptation. It almost made me think that you could think of the different domains of individuation themselves in these terms, like the passage from the well, I guess psychic in the sense that it involves perception, individuation at the end of the vital individuation section, where the affectivity, which had a kind of regulatory function with respect to like brute physical perception, that affectivity sort of becomes a problem for the, I guess, sufficiently complex vital individual, and this new problematic is what leads to the development of transindividual reality. And so you could almost see these stages of progression in human infancy as being analogous to the, I guess, stages of progression, if you can call it a progression, from one domain of individuation to another.
Yeah, I think there's a certain amount of ambiguity in Simondon in terms of how we're meant to think of the relationship between the different domains of individuation to each other. So, are we supposed to think of vital individuation, for example, as being like sort of beyond or superior to physical individuation? Um, there's certain respects in which that does seem to be the case, where he does seem to think of the progression from physical to vital and then vital to psychical and so on, as being a sort of progression of more structured or better, or in some sense superior domains. But then there's also another sense in which, like in the physical individuation chapter, he talks about the elementary particles. Like there's the whole section on quantum physics, which is kind of an aside, I think. It's not really part of this like linear progression from physical to vital and so on. It's like it's almost like a different branch of reality. So there's I think potentially a sort of branching structure where you wouldn't have one linear progression of one domain to the next, but you would have like multiple different domains sort of branching off of each other that may not have they may not be comparable to each other. So like is a living being more advanced or more structured or whatever than an electron, for example? I'm not sure that there's an answer to that question for Simondon. So I think I think he sometimes talks about the relationship between these domains as a kind of linear progression, and sometimes he also has other elements that don't really fit that linear progression model. So yeah, we can certainly see something like an adaptation and de-adaptation process going on in terms of the way that different domains of individuation are related to each other. But I think we should also keep in mind these sort of other branches of reality that maybe don't fit on that single progression.
Sorry, this is the last thing I wanted to add on this section, but the way that the disadaptation, there's the adaptation, then the de-differentiation, but the initial adaptation isn't entirely lost. It's sort of built into the new adaptation that comes out of it. It reminded me of that when he was talking about the personality in Volume 1, and he talks about how the mature personality is like constructed by successive crises, and that truly mature personality recapitulates everything in the history of the, I guess, psychic individual. And he refers to the expression etiam peccata, from St. Augustine. I'll post this quote in the chat. But it seems like it's a similar development that he has in mind in these two cases.
Yeah, I think that's like a completely parallel sort of concept here. So this notion of the etiam peccata is Augustine has this idea that the even our sins are sort of part of the process of our coming to God. Part of our life history that leads us to a relationship with God is includes those sins that are in a certain sense leading us away from God. So Simondon wants to or his conception of this mature individual is one. So you can think of I'm sure all of us did things when we were teenagers that we regret and sort of look back on with embarrassment and so on. But all those things that we did or experienced in those times sort of contribute to making us who we are now. So like a fully mature sort of personality would be one that would be able to sort of accept all of those other aspects, even the ones that you're not proud of or that you think were mistakes. When you look back on them, you can say that it was a part of leading you to where you are now, and it was a necessary part of your personality. And so these mistakes would be analogous to the de-differentiation that the infant undergoes, and they're sort of conserved. The earlier stages that you went through are conserved and sort of repurposed in the new structure. Okay, let's go on to the next bit. I'm not sure if we're going to get through everything today, but that's fine. We don't have a deadline or anything. So if someone would like to read from the top of 692.
Yeah, I can read again. The authors we have just cited place these pulsations of the ontogenesis of behavior in parallel with the discoveries of geneticists, who represent the structures of genes as intersecting assemblages between chains of molecules. They want to find a much more general basis for this notion of correlation between chains. For them, moreover, the organism's maturation would take place according to a certain gradient, according to the cephalocaudal and proximodistal axis. And the organism's maturation could be considered to take place beginning with one pole, the cephalic pole, and then would pass through the organism in successive waves as if there were structural seeds contained in the cephalic axis, propagating transductively throughout the whole body. Consequently, organic maturation itself, which is the condition of this alternation between adaptation and evolution, would be accomplished according to a transductive process in which there would be the propagation of a form taking, the extension of an organization based on a reservoir of forms or a birthplace of forms in the organism. Consequently, it would have to be said that in such a doctrine, the form remains archetypal in a certain sense due to its anteriority and its initial non-eminence to the structurable field, which is its matter. Nevertheless, this form can only structure the field because the latter is in a metastable state and can pass to the stable state when it receives the form. In the transductive operation of modulation, which is veritably the hylomorphic operation, not just any form can unleash the actualization of potential energy of any metastable field whatsoever. The tension of a schema's form depends on the field to which it is applied. A supersaturated or supercooled liquid cannot crystallize based on any germ whatsoever. The crystalline germ must be of the same crystalline system as the crystallizable body. There is consequently a certain freedom, albeit a limited freedom, in the possible couplings of form and matter. This, in the course of an ontogenesis, the contributions of structure, due to external circumstances, can somewhat orient the structuration that comes after a de-differentiation. But a structural germ that deviates too much from the characteristics of the structurable field no longer possesses any tension of information with respect to this field. Tension can only be defined in a field that can form a circuit. It is not a property of the isolated source, but of the source plus receiver system. Yeah, it's a little confusing to me that he talks about the non-immanence of the crystalline germ to the structurable field. And this may go to the problem that we've talked about a couple of times with basically where the pre-individual begins, or where the first sort of seed crystal comes from, which is the same as asking like how you end up with a system with two terms in the first place, two terms that can be said to be in disparation and then signify out of that disparation, because even in the introduction, he talks about an immanence of the negative between the two terms in the pre-individual, which is the difference between them, which makes the signification possible. So it's strange that he sort of seems to be saying that the crystal is transcendent to the field in this paragraph.
Yeah, I think you're right to tie this in with the problem of where the crystalline germ comes from in the first place, because if I remember correctly, in the discussion portion of this text, which is not included in the volume that we're reading now, one of the participants asks him this question or a similar question about where the structural germ comes from, and he says something like, I hesitate to ascribe it to chance or something like that. In the case of the crystal, there is a certain chance element to it where a slight irregularity in the solution leads to a crystal forming in one location and so on. But I think he doesn't want to use chance as his explanation or as his principle here. Another sort of answer that you could give would be like the Spinozistic answer, and just say that each germ crystal is the result of a previous operation of structuration, which in turn is a result of another previous operation of structuration, going back to infinity. There's no starting point. It's just just these operations of structuration going on forever. Again, that may not be that satisfying either. But I think here we can think of this, the non-immanence of the form here has to do with so I think the non-immanence of the form that he talks about here and the immanence of negation in the disparation that he talks about in the introduction, I think those are compatible with each other. So I think the immanence of the disparation is something that exists in the pre-individual before it undergoes any process of individuation. So it's only because there is this disparation, this tension within the pre-individual reality, that it is capable of undergoing transformation and structuration later on once it encounters the crystalline germ or the structural principle. But then this structuring principle is something that comes from outside. It's not immanent to the system, the pre-individual reality itself. So the crystal example, the solution doesn't crystallize until you introduce a germ crystal into it, and then it undergoes structuration. So it's in that sense that the structural principle is non-immanent, or the form is non-immanent, whereas the negative term or negation is immanent to the solution before the crystallization happens.
I wonder how we could think of like the development of binocular vision in vital individuation, because that's the paradigm in reference to which I always understand disparation, because there it seems like there are the two terms, which is the vision on the one retina and then the vision on the other retina, And these are the two terms out of which the signification of three-dimensional vision arises. But it seems like if the disparation has to exist in the pre-individual system, or the pre-individual field in the physical example of the crystal, then you have this extra term that doesn't exist in the visual disparation example, where there are just these two terms and then the signification between them. There's no seed crystal there.
Yeah, that's a good point. He is going to talk about binocular vision a little bit later in this text. So maybe we can come back to that thought when we get to that point. But I think, I think the idea here of disparation and then the discovery of a structure, I think we can think of the I guess the schema or the structure of the third dimension as being the germ crystal that brings about the structuration of the situation in which you have disparation between the two retinal images. So it's this discovery of the structure is analogous to the insertion of the crystal, the germ crystal, into the solution. And So in this case, it's not obvious that that this is a non-immanent form. You could describe the situation as one in which the binocular disparation sort of imminently bears within it the solution to the problem of disparation and the perception of depth. But let's come back to this question when we get to that part in a couple pages where he talks about the binocular vision example.
Sounds good.
Okay. So I can read the next bit. Right. Therefore, in such a theory, we find the idea according to which we cannot explain the genesis of a living being without invoking two very distinct principles: an origin of forms, here the cephalocaudal axis, and a field, a domain that receives these forms and through which, starting with the pole of this origin of forms, progressive extension occurs. Should this be brought closer in line with the theory of biological organizers? Perhaps. In any case, we must keep the idea according to which a de-differentiation of the field of behavior or corporeal field, is necessary so that a new structuration can be transmitted into it. Thus, for the study of the individual, we will arrive at a new principle that would account for the two aspects of form evoked a moment ago: the archetypal aspect and the hylomorphic aspect. There must be a field that externally de-differentiates because it is essentially internally potentialized. This field would perhaps correspond to Aristotelian matter insofar as it can receive a form. The field that can receive a form is the system in which accumulated potential energies constitute a metastability favorable to transformations. A behavior that disadapts and then de-differentiates is a domain in which there is incompatibility in tension. It is a domain whose state becomes metastable. An adaptation that no longer corresponds to the external world, whose inadequacy with respect to the milieu reverberates within the organism, constitutes a metastability that corresponds to a problem to be resolved. There is an impossibility for the being to continue living without changing state, i.e. structural and functional regime. This vital metastability is analogous to the supersaturation and supercooling of physical substances. This supertense and consequently metastable state is favorable to a transductive form taking based on a structural germ. The moment this germ presents itself, it modulates the closest region of the field. Form taking propagates and spreads throughout the whole field. In this conception, the totality, which was simultaneous and comprehensive, self-coherent and united with itself from the start in Gestalt theory, which makes the whole into an organic structure of totality, Goldstein evokes the Parmenidean spheros, becomes the metastable domain that is capable of crystallizing as soon as a formal germ is contributed to it. The archetype would be this formal germ that can initiate form taking only at a certain moment of supersaturation, and thus a certain moment of an organism's maturation. Perhaps this is how the notion of archetypal form and hylomorphic relation could be applied to the ontogenesis of behavior and to the maturation of organic systems, thanks to an energetic theory of form concerning fields of metastability. There is not enough space to say how this doctrine could also be applied to the genesis of thought. However, we could say the following. We could consider the acquisition of empiria, the repeatability of experiments, as the activity that makes the domain of mental content pass from a non-saturated state to a supersaturated state. The experiment relative to the same object adds and superposes partially contradictory aspects, thus producing a metastable state of knowledge relative to the object. There is an operation of form taking because at this moment a structural germ appears as a new dimension. We have a structuration that extends over this metastable field that the experiment is. For example, the left half field and the right half field in vision would lead to diplopia if the direct contents of the messages contributed by each retina remained in the subject's vision. Incompatibility and supersaturation are avoided if we discover the dimension of the detachments of depths of field. The discovery of structure does not amount to conserving everything that is contributed by the left eye and everything that is contributed by the right eye. Furthermore, there is a utilization of what can be called binocular disparation, i.e. the degree of non-coincidence of the left and right messages for perceiving the staggering of fields. A theory of perception, theory of the relation between different sensorial messages, would be possible based on this notion of the structuration of saturated fields. This would consequently be the indication of a new path of research for individual psychology. The analogous principle at the origin of the energetic theory of form-taking is drawn from the physical study of crystallization, whose effectuation begins with a crystalline germ in a domain where there is either supercooling or supersaturation, which are approximately equivalent conditions, and which make possible the formation of an artificial crystal based on a crystalline germ. An energetic conception of form-taking can unite with the schemas of thought shared by information theory and cybernetics. Indeed, the action of the structural germ on the structurable field in a metastable field that contains a potential energy is a modulation. The archetypal germ can be quite small and may not add any or almost any energy. It is enough for the germ to possess a very weak modulatory field, but this field is comparable to the weak current that is contributed to the grid of a triode, and this extremely low energy, with the minimal field that it creates between the cathode and the control grid, can counterbalance the strong field that exists between the anode and the cathode. This minimal field, several volts, manages to counterbalance in the opposite direction the much larger field, 100 to 300 volts, that exists between the cathode and the anode. And due to the fact that this field created by the grid is more or less antagonist of the other, it is capable of modulating the potential energy of the source of the anode-cathode tension and is therefore capable of conditioning considerable effects in the external actuator. Wouldn't such an exercise of conditioning causality be carried out when a structural germ, coming into a metastable milieu, a milieu rich in potential energy, manages to spread its structure throughout this field? Instead of conceiving an archetypal form that dominates the totality and radiates above it like the Platonic archetype, could we not posit the possibility of a transductive propagation of form-taking that incrementally advances with the field? Let me stop here because this is a multi-page paragraph. Right, so here we have this example of binocular vision, and he does seem to suggest that, so right at the bottom of 693 to top of 694, he says, there is an operation of form-taking because at this moment a structural germ appears as a new dimension, and we have a structuration that extends over this metastable field that the experiment is. Experiment, I actually don't have the French text with me right now, but the word experiment in French is the same as experience, it's expérience. And so I think maybe experience would be a better translation here. So he's talking, I think when he says about this structural germ appears as a new dimension, he's talking about the disparation example. So I think he does want us to see the discovery of the new dimension in binocular vision as an instance of the structural germ structuring a field.
Yeah, it seems like it's a crucial difference, though, like, as you mentioned when we were discussing that last section, whether the structural germ is immanent to the field or transcendent, as he sometimes suggests the seed crystal is. I think we've talked about this a few times, but I think you can see in the crystallization example, the germ itself is one of the terms of the disparation, and then the supersaturated solution is another term, and it's the putting into contact of those two terms, or the internal resonance. Maybe you could see the initiation of resonance as the contingent factor, what enables the communication between the two terms, rather than there being like two terms in the field and then a third term. But I would need to think through some of the many other examples of disparation that he gives, and I guess think about whether or not the signification is immanent, or if there's often this third transcendent term.
Yeah, one sort of solution to the difficulty could be that there are just different kinds of transduction. In some cases, you have a transcendent structural term or this archetypal form that is imposed on something from without, and then maybe in other situations you have an immanent form that arises out of the situation. But he doesn't, tell us that. It doesn't seem like he wants to sort of classify transduction in terms of immanence and transcendence. So yeah, that's I think a sort of open problem of how to understand that aspect of the relationship between the structural term and the energetic and material terms.
But it could be an ignorant question. What exactly then crystalline germ? Is it just a stimulator from the outside? What could it function as a crystalline germ?
Yeah, this is the sort of the big question, or one of the big questions that he doesn't really deal with is, where does this crystalline germ come from? And yeah, so he sort of requires the existence of this crystalline germ, but yeah, he doesn't really account for where it might come from. So one, yeah, what I suggested earlier is one way of thinking about this would be just the sort of like Spinoza's account of causes. And there's just each crystalline germ is the result of a previous process of individuation, and there's just this infinite sequence of individuation processes. But I'm not sure that's the kind of solution that Simondon would appreciate.
Yeah, in a way, I'm thinking maybe like it's one of the stimulus. The difference is like it is a differentiating stimulus, which is like connected to the next step. So whether they like out of a lot of so-called causes or stimuli, kind of the cause or the stimulus which is associated with some kind of consequence. Some kind of moving to the transduction, like moving to the next level. Next level. That's kind of called the crystalline germ, something like that. Just guess.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It seems like the crystalline germ has to be something that exists before the process of transduction can start. That's how it seems to be presented throughout his various discussions of this concept. So yeah, it seems like we need something that already exists before the individuation process, but it does seem as if it already has the nature of an individual. It seems like the crystalline germ is already an individual before the individuation process starts. So that leaves us with a question of, where does this individual come from?
All right, thank you.
Maybe in addition to the Spinozist answer that you mentioned, you could give a Kantian answer and just say, yeah, there's an indefinite regression, and whenever you get to a new signification, if you look at the causes, there will be a disparation with terms that are themselves the products of other significations, and it's just indefinitely as far as you go back. That's what you'll run into.
Yeah, we have an antinomy, and then we can't apply our concepts to things as they are in themselves and so on. Yeah, that would be another answer, but I think again one that Simondon would not be very willing to agree to. But yeah, I think we have to sort of leave that question where it is. Yeah, so let's go on to the next bit from the top of 695, if someone else would like to read.
Oh, let me read then. In the sense,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
Unless the 61 wants to read, I can just go. In the sense,
yeah, go ahead.
Maybe.
Yeah.
In a sense, it would suffice to suppose that after having modulated a zone immediately in contact with it, the archetypal germ utilizes this immediately approximate zone as a new archetypal germ to go further. There would be a progressive local change of the ontological status of the milieu. The initial archetypal germ would produce around the first zone of crystallization. It would thus create a slightly larger modulator, and then this modulator would create a slightly larger modulator around it, and it would grow bit by bit, all while the limit would remain modulatory. This is how a crystal advances when an artificial crystal is sustained. Starting with a microscopic crystalline germ, a monocrystalline solid of several cubic decimeters can be produced. Does the activity of thought involve a similar process? Mutandis? It would particularly look for the foundation of the power of discovery via analogy, the fact of having resolved the problems of limited field of our content of thought by means of certain mental schema allows for the passage to another element constructively and for the improvement of the understanding. At the very least, this is a proposed schema for interpreting one of the progresses of thought that does not allow itself to be reduced to pure induction or pure deduction. If we step back from the individual being, we can wonder whether social reality also contains potentials. Social and psychosocial phenomena are generally explained by processes of interaction, but as Norbert Wiener notes, it is very difficult to introduce probabilistic theories into the social domain. He would use the comparison that I cannot fully develop here, but which is summed up in the following way. To introduce a broader sampling into probabilistic studies no better than to increase the aperture of a lens when the precision of this lens is not greater than the wavelength of light. We do not attain a superior reserving power by increasing the aperture of a lens if the lens is not sufficiently perfect. Norbert Wiener is basically saying that random variations in the samplings of the human social domain do not permit veritable predictably or veritable explanations, since the more the samplings are broadened, the more heterogeneous they are. Wiener arrives at this idea that probabilistic theories are weak in the sociological or psychological domain. With an energetic theory of form-taking, we would have a non-probabilistic method that does not grant any privilege to stable configurations. We would consider that what is most important to explain in the psychosocial domain is what happens when metastable states are involved. What creates configurations is form-taking achieved in a metastable field. Yet these metastable states exist. I know very well that these are not generally laboratory states, but hot states, as Jacob Moreno said, i.e. states that cannot be experimented on for long. Probably here. I can stop? Or
You can continue the rest of this paragraph. Thanks.
okay. You're welcome. In this case, we can organize the psychodramas or sociodramas. We also cannot trace the sociograms that correspond to them. But a pre-revolutionary state seems to be the exact type of psychosocial state to study with the hypothesis we are presenting here. A pre-revolutionary state, a state of supersaturation, is one in which an event is right on the verge of taking place, one in which a structure is about to be emerged. All it takes is for the structure germ to appear, and sometimes chance can produce the equivalent of the structure germ. In a very remarkable study by M.P. Auger, it is noted that the crystalline germ can be replaced in certain cases by random encounters or a correlation of chance among molecules. Similarly, perhaps in certain pre-revolutionary states, resurrection can occur, either due to the fact that an idea descends from elsewhere and immediately leads to a structure that spreads elsewhere, everywhere, or perhaps due to a fortuitous encounter, even though it is quite difficult to admit that chance have the value of creating a form. Here, right? Stop.
Yeah, that's a good place to stop. Thanks. This notion of chance comes up again here that I had mentioned earlier. So here he says it is quite difficult to admit that chance has the value of creating good form. So he seems to be hesitant to ascribe to chance the capacity of producing something like a good form. even though he does sort of recognize the possibility that chance encounters of molecules, for example, might bring about a crystallization, or a chance event, a chance circumstance might bring about a revolutionary event in the social domain. He sort of recognizes the role of chance on the one hand, but then he doesn't really want chance to be sort of responsible for generating good form on the other hand. So he's kind of stuck. He doesn't really have a good account of what the relationship is between chance and the structural principle, this crystalline germ principle.
I think it reminds me of the book. When I started to be interested in Simondon, there was a book. Actually, I forgot the author. He is like American guy, like who wrote the book of kind of like it summarizes like the core idea of Simondon. And then what is his name? I wrote an email to him, but I can't remember. Anyhow, according to him, like the last chapter is talking about like the meaning of individuation, psychic individuation, collective individuation, and what he said is like kind of after passing of the person of a person, still like something remains like in at the level of the collectivity, such and such. So what I'm thinking about here is like a chance event, the implications of individuations, all the processes, how it is decided. It actually that has to do with the according to the spatial temporal context, as far as I think. Quite interesting part, but yeah, it's not really clear.
Yeah, it's definitely a difficult passage here. And the bit you were talking about in volume 1, where he talks about what remains of a person after death, and so he suggests that we can think of the sort of collective individuation. The way that a person is embedded in a collective is something that can survive after death. So a person has relations to other people, and those other people sort of preserve the memory of the dead person. And so part of what constitutes the personality of the person when they're alive is those relations. And so those relations don't disappear with the death of the person. And so part of your personality survives after death insofar as your relations to other people and your insertion into the collective are part of your personality. And so I'm not sure exactly how that connects with the this notion of chance here, but I think we have this sort of ambiguous role of chance in bringing about individuation that Simondon talks about here in this passage that we just read. And you could potentially have a similarly ambiguous role of chance in the sort of life history and then eventually death of an individual. So in volume 1, he talks about how there's a sort of internal aspect of death in the sense that you, by undergoing individuation, you sort of use up potentials, and death would be the sort of exhaustion of the potentials that an individual contains within it. But then there's also this sort of external aspect of death, the contingent event that occurs. Like obviously there's instances like getting hit by a car or whatever that are not internal. So these types of there would be a role of chance in the end of life or the end of individuation, in the same way that there's a role of chance in the onset of individuation.
So in French also chance, like a chance here.
I don't have the French text with me, but I think it's probably hasard.
Hasard, par hasard. Then
yeah, exactly.
Then is it like événement, like event?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on which author you're talking about, whether an event would be something that has to do with chance. Uh, so yeah, like the whole like Mallarmé and that whole sort of vein of thought has to do with a certain role of chance in the event. So an event as such is something that has a chance element to it. Whereas I think in Deleuze, I think there's not necessarily this notion of chance as part of the constitution of an event. So I think it depends on the author. I don't think there's like um, a, a sort of essential link between chance and event in the French language.
Oh, okay, thank you. By the way, the name of the author the book of I mentioned is David Scott.
Oh, okay, right, yeah, that's the one. I think it's called like a reader's guide to individuation, psychic
Right.
individuation, or something like that.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Yeah. Let me. Yeah. Let's go on to the next bit. I think maybe I'll just read to the end. Yeah. Let's do that. So that'll be just a page and a half. In any case, we would arrive at the idea according to which a human science must be founded on a human energetics and not just on a morphology. A morphology is quite important, but an energetics is necessary. One would have to ask why societies transform, why groups change in accordance with the conditions of metastability. However, we certainly see that what is most important in the life of social groups is not merely the fact that they are stable, but that at certain moments they cannot conserve their structure. They become incompatible with respect to themselves, they de-differentiate and become supersaturated. Just as the infant can no longer remain in a state of adaptation, these groups disadapt. In colonization, for example, during a certain amount of time, there is possible cohabitation between colonists and colonized. And then all of a sudden, this is no longer possible because potentials are born and a new structure must suddenly appear. And it must be a true structure, i.e., one truly emerging from an invention, an emergence of form for this state to crystallize. If not, one remains in a state of disadaptation and de-differentiation comparable to maladjustment, as studied by Gazelle and Carmichael. Consequently, here we are witnessing a perspective for creating a human science. This would be an energetics in a certain sense, but this would be an energetics that accounted for processes of form taking and attempted to unite in a single principle the archetypal aspect with the notion of structural germ and the aspect of relation between matter and form. In conclusion, in the unity of the operation of the transductive form taking of the metastable field, we will propose that in human science we distinguish between field and domain. We should reserve the notion of field for that which exists within an archetype, i.e., for these almost paradoxical structures that have served as a germ for the individual, as we said earlier. A field would be the tension of form, just as there is a field between the two armatures of a charged condenser. We should call domain the ensemble of reality that can receive a structuration, that can take form through a transductive operation or another operation, for the transductive operation is perhaps not the only one that exists. There are also disruptive processes which are not structuring but merely destructive. The domain of metastability will be modulated by the field of form. The second distinction, which extends into an axiological principle, consists in opposing disadaptation and degradation. Disadaptation within a domain, the incompatibility of configurations within the domain, and internal de-differentiation should not be assimilated with a degradation. They are the necessary condition of a form taking. They in fact mark the genesis of a potential energy that will make transduction possible, i.e., the fact that the form will advance within this domain. If this disadaptation never takes place, if this supersaturation is not there, i.e., an interior reverberation that renders subsets homogeneous with respect to one another, just as thermal agitation makes all molecules collide much more frequently in inner space, then transduction is not possible. In other words, we should consider the process of de-differentiation within a social body or within an individual entering into a crisis period, just as the alchemists of yesteryear considered liquefactio, dissolution, or nigrefactio, putrefaction, i.e., the first moment of the magnum opus, when alchemists placed the prima materia into the retort. The magnum opus began by dissolving everything in mercury or reducing everything to the state of carbon, wherein nothing is distinguished, wherein substances lose their limit and their individuality, their isolation. After this crisis and this sacrifice comes a new differentiation. This is albification, followed by the cauda pavonis, or peacock's tail, which makes objects emerge from the confused night, just like the dawn distinguishes them by their color. Jung discovers in the alchemist's aspiration the expression of the operation of individuation and of all the forms of sacrifice, which suppose the return to a state comparable to that of birth, i.e., a return to a richly potentialized, not yet determined state, a domain for the new propagation of life. it is possible to generalize this schema and to elaborate it through the notion of information, through the study of the metastability of conditions. If it is possible to generalize this schema and to elaborate it through the notion of information, through the study of the metastability of conditions, we can set out to found the axiomatics of a human science on a new theory of form. Right. So this bit is pretty dense and kind of weird. So this bit about alchemy is something that, to my recollection, he never talks about anywhere else. So this sort of analogy with alchemy, I think, doesn't really help make things clearer unless you already know about alchemy, which I don't. But I think he wants us to see this notion of de-differentiation and disadaptation as something that is not necessarily negative or not necessarily a kind of degradation. It's something that that can be a part of a progression to a higher state of structure. So, like in the example of the infant learning to walk, the adaptation of crawling can undergo this de-differentiation or this disadaptation, but that's just a stage on the step towards walking. And then likewise in social situations, a crisis or some sort of apparent disadaptation is not necessarily something negative in itself. It can also be a stage in the process of generating a new structure.
So that what it means, like every process has its own meaning. Like there's no negative kind of action or reaction, something like that, right? Everything contributes to the new form, generating new forms. That's what it says.
Well, he does say that he says there are also disruptive processes which are not structuring but merely destructive. So it does seem like there are destructive processes that are not part of a structuration, but it's also the case that some processes of apparent destructuring or de-differentiation are just moments in a process of structuration. So I think we can at least leave open the possibility that certain processes that may look like a destructive process, they might be parts of a larger process of structuration that requires us to invent or discover new forms and new structures.
So kind of like to the conclusion, like that is maybe a really big difference between like the traditional idea of the form and the matter, something like that, like compared to the previous ideas. Like what Simon Dong emphasizes there is kind of a continuing incessant process of transformation. Like of course he used the word the transduction and then coexistence of like something fixed and then something unfixed altogether. Those kind of things, like the kind of like really highlighted the part compared to traditional ones, if we conclude.
Yeah, and so the one aspect of the difference between Simondon's account and a traditional hylomorphic account is that in the hylomorphic account you just have the matter and then the form that is imposed on it, and any sort of de-differentiation would be something like a degradation, would be a loss of form. So it's only by losing form that matter could be de-differentiated. Whereas for Simondon here, he's going to, or what he's set out in this passage that we just read is the idea that a de-differentiation can be part of the process of taking on a new form. And so that's something that is not part of the hylomorphic schema.
Oh, sure. Thank you.
Yeah, so we have officially finished individuation. It took us, I think, more than a year. I don't know exactly when we started. But so thanks everyone for coming out and for all your contributions. I've definitely learned a lot by going through the book in a great amount of detail that I hadn't done before, and so I'm glad that we went through this.
Hey, thank you so much. You were great leading. Without you, nothing would have been possible. Definitely. Thank you so much.
Oh well, thank you. So yeah, we have the text for imagination and invention. So let's I'll post that again in the forum section, and yeah, let's see if we can get maybe some other people might be interested in joining when we start that one. And yeah, so let's start on that next week.